All right, so we're back for another deep dive. This time it's AstraZeneca
AstraZeneca, yeah.
and specifically their 2024 performance.
Yeah.
And to do that, we're going to be using, their annual report.
The big one, the annual
No,
report.
that's right, the 2024 PDF, all 100-something pages of it. We've been through it, of course, so you don't have to.
Yeah, we've pulled out the good stuff for you.
Hopefully. At
Yeah.
least that's the plan. We'll see how we do. But yeah, what we're going to try to do today is break down AstraZeneca's business,
Yeah.
help you understand how it works, how it did in 2024, and what they're thinking about for the future.
Yeah, kind of a 360 view of the company,
Yeah.
where they are now, where they want to be.
Exactly. So we'll be looking at their different business segments, their financial performance, all that good stuff. And yeah, let's dive in, shall we?
Let's do it.
Okay, so first up, let's talk about how AstraZeneca actually makes its money.
Right.
What are the different parts of their business?
Yeah, the business segments.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now, 2024 was a big year for them, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
25th anniversary.
25 years. Can you believe it?
I know. It feels like just yesterday they were
Just a little startup, right?
just a little startup, yeah. So what stood out to you about their performance this year and, what they're saying about their ambitions for the future?
Well, I think the thing that really struck me was their ambition. It's like huge. They're not just aiming for, a little bit of growth here and there. They want to be pioneers in science,
Mm.
leaders in their disease areas.
Wow.
They talk about transforming patient outcomes, and they have these really concrete goals to back that up.
Okay, like what?
So by 2030, they want to launch at least 20 new medicines,
20.
at least 20, yeah. And they're aiming for $80 billion in total revenue.
That's a lot of revenue.
It is, and they're expecting that growth to keep going even after 2030.
So, big plans. And it's not just about the money, is it? They're also talking a lot about sustainability.
Right. They're actually aiming for net zero carbon emissions by 2045.
Yeah.
So they're really thinking long term, not just about the next quarter or the next year.
Well, it's interesting because sometimes these big companies, you wonder if they're really serious about that kind of thing.
Yeah, you could.
Or if it's just,
Greenwashing.
Exactly. But it sounds like they're putting their money where their mouth is.
Yeah, they are. And they're making real progress. They've already significantly reduced their emissions.
Okay, so they've got the big goals, the long-term vision. What about, the here and now? What did they actually achieve in 2024?
Well, they had a really good year in terms of scientific breakthroughs and moving their drug pipeline forward.
Yeah,
They got approval for several new medicines.
I remember seeing that.
Voidea, Cavigali, Batroway.
Uh-huh.
8 new approvals in total. That's pretty impressive for a single year.
Yeah, it is. It really shows that their R&D engine is firing on all cylinders, doesn't it?
It does. And it's not just about the approvals.
They also had 24 pipeline progressions. So that's things like starting phase 2 trials, moving projects within phase 2, and making decisions to invest in phase 3.
Right.
And they got 28 regulatory designations across 18 different projects. Breakthrough therapy, priority review, fast track, all that kind of stuff.
So a lot of positive momentum.
Yeah.
But I did notice they also talked about one program that didn't work out.
Yeah, the Vermircopan program.
Right.
They had to terminate the phase 2 development for rare diseases. It's interesting that they chose to highlight that.
It is, because usually companies want to, focus on the good news.
Yeah, sweep the failures under the rug.
Exactly. So why do you think they did that?
Well, I think it shows that they're willing to be transparent
Okay.
and that they're not afraid to admit when something doesn't work out.
Which is important, right? Because drug development is inherently risky.
It is. It's not always going to be a home run. And I think by acknowledging that, it actually builds trust with investors.
Yeah, it does.
It shows that they're being realistic and that they're learning from their mistakes.
So it's kind of a reminder that, even with the best science and the best intentions, things don't always go to plan.
Exactly.
But overall, it sounds like AstraZeneca is really focused on pushing the boundaries of science and developing new treatments.
They are.
And one trend I noticed in the report is their emphasis on earlier treatment interventions.
Right.
They're talking about, moving earlier in the treatment of diseases to improve outcomes. Why is that such a big deal?
Well, think about it this way. If you can catch a disease in its early stages, before it's had a chance to really take hold, you have a much better chance of treating it successfully.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And in some cases, you might even be able to prevent the disease from progressing altogether.
So early intervention is key.
It is. And AstraZeneca is really investing in this area, developing diagnostics and therapies that can be used proactively.
Yeah.
They're also focusing more on combination therapies, particularly in oncology.
Okay, so that's like using multiple drugs together to attack the disease from different angles.
Exactly. And that can be much more effective than using just one drug.
Yeah.
They're also thinking about combinations in weight management, which is interesting.
So kind of like a more holistic approach to treatment, right?
Exactly. They're also focused on making treatments more patient-friendly, which I think is really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Things like developing devices and formulations that are easier to use and that fit into people's lives.
So not just about the science, but also about the patient experience.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about their scientific progress and their strategy.
Yep.
Now let's zoom out a bit and look at the global picture.
The big map.
Yeah, the U.S. seems to be a pretty big deal for them, right?
Yeah, it's a huge market for them.
43% of their total revenue in 2024.
And they're the #1 pharmaceutical company across their therapy areas in the U.S., which is pretty significant.
It is. And globally, pharmaceutical sales grew by almost 10% in 2024.
Yeah, the market's growing, and they're growing with it.
So how are they thinking about growth in different parts of the world?
Well, they're seeing strong growth in emerging markets like Southeast and East Asia, Latin America.
Which makes sense, right? Those economies are growing and healthcare spending is going up.
Exactly. And they have specific growth estimates for different regions, so it seems like they have a pretty nuanced approach to different markets.
Okay.
They're not just using a one-size-fits-all strategy.
They're tailoring their approach to the specific needs and opportunities of each region.
Right.
Okay, so let's move on to another important aspect of their business, sustainability.
Yeah.
And I'm not just talking about the kind of long-term sustainability we talked about earlier
Yeah.
with their 2045 net zero goals. I'm talking about their environmental impact, their social responsibility, all that good stuff.
Right, the ESG stuff.
Exactly.
And they're actually doing a lot in this area. They've already significantly reduced their greenhouse gas emissions.
77.5% reduction in Scope 1 and 2 emissions since 2015. That's pretty impressive.
It is. And they have even more ambitious targets for the future.
Okay, like what?
They're aiming for a 98% absolute reduction in Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2026.
Wow.
And a 50% reduction in total Scope 3 emissions by 2030.
So they're really serious about this.
Mm.
But why is it so important for a company like AstraZeneca?
Well, for one thing, it's just the right thing to do.
Okay.
They have a responsibility to minimize their impact on the environment,
Yeah.
but it's also good for business.
Okay, how so?
Investors are increasingly focused on ESG factors,
Makes sense.
and consumers are more likely to support companies that are doing their part to be sustainable, so it can really enhance their reputation and attract investors and customers.
Yeah.
And they have some specific initiatives that are pretty interesting.
Oh, like what?
They're transitioning Breztri, which is one of their respiratory medicines, to a next-generation propellant that has near zero global warming potential.
So they're not just reducing their own emissions.
Right.
They're also thinking about the environmental impact of their products.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already. We've talked about their business segments, their scientific progress, their global strategy, their sustainability initiatives. What else should we know about what AstraZeneca's been up to?
Well, they've also been pretty active on the acquisition front.
Acquisitions, yeah.
They've made a few notable acquisitions in 2024.
Okay, which one stood out to you?
Well, there was Icosavax, Gricel, and Amolet Pharma.
Okay, and what were they after with those?
Icosavax is all about vaccines.
Okay.
It strengthens their portfolio, particularly in combination respiratory vaccines.
Okay.
Gricel is a cell therapy company.
Cell therapy, that's a hot area.
It is, and it gives them a foothold in that space, including CAR-T therapies for blood cancers.
Okay, and Amelie.
Amolet Pharma focuses on rare endocrinology.
Okay.
So they're expanding into new areas, filling gaps in their pipeline, diversifying their offerings. It's all about strategic growth.
But of course, growth and innovation always come with challenges.
Of course.
And the report does mention some potential headwinds.
Yeah, they talk about the risks associated with new technologies like AI.
AI, yeah.
Things like intellectual property, data privacy, and then there's the evolving regulatory landscape, which is always a challenge for pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, it can be hard to keep up with the rules and regulations.
It can. And they also talk about some broader societal challenges that could impact their business.
Okay, like what?
Things like climate change, aging populations, rising healthcare costs.
So factors that are outside their control, but could still have a big impact on their business.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about their business, their strategy, their challenges.
We have.
Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty, the financials,
The numbers.
the numbers. How did AstraZeneca actually do in 2024?
Well, let's start with earnings per share, or EPS.
EPS, okay.
One of the most important metrics for investors.
Yeah, because it tells you how much profit the company is making for each share of stock.
Exactly. And their core EPS grew by 15% to $8.21.
Core EPS.
Right.
So that's like their earnings, but excluding any one-time or unusual items?
Yeah, so it gives you a clearer picture of their ongoing profitability.
Okay.
And the reported EPS, which includes everything, grew by 13% to $4.54.
So healthy growth in both metrics.
Yeah.
What else should we be paying attention to?
Well, they highlight their strong cash generation, which is really important. It's the lifeblood of any business.
Cash is king.
It is. It allows them to reinvest in the business, make acquisitions, pay dividends.
Okay.
And speaking of dividends,
Let's talk about those.
they recommended a second interim dividend, bringing the total for the year to $3.10 per share.
Which is good news for investors.
It is, and they emphasize their progressive dividend policy, meaning they intend to maintain or grow the dividend each year.
So a nice, predictable income stream. Okay, so they're doing well on the profitability front, generating cash, paying dividends.
Yep.
But where is all that money actually coming from? What are their key products?
Well, oncology is a big area for them.
Oncology, yeah.
Tagrisso, which is for lung cancer, brought in $6.58 billion.
That's a lot of money.
It is. It was up 13%, driven by its use in earlier stages of the disease.
Okay.
And Imfinzi, another cancer drug, saw an even bigger jump, 20% to $3.67 billion.
Wow.
They're getting approvals for it in more and more indications.
So they're really strong in the oncology market.
They are, but it's not just oncology. Farxiga, which is for type 2 diabetes, heart failure, and chronic kidney disease, is a huge seller.
Yeah, I remember seeing that in the report.
$7.72 billion in revenue, up 29%.
Wow.
It's the top SGLT2 inhibitor globally.
Okay, and what about some of their newer drugs?
Well, Tezspire for severe asthma is doing really well.
Okay.
Revenue is up 98%. And then there's Safnello for systemic lupus erythematosus. That was up 69%.
So a really diverse portfolio of products.
Yeah, they're not reliant on any one particular drug or therapeutic area.
Which is good for long-term stability, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about their revenue. Let's talk about their expenses.
Right.
Reported operating expenses increased by 11%, but their core operating expenses actually decreased by 13%.
Right. There's always a difference between the two.
Yeah, because of those one-time items and adjustments.
Exactly. But the important thing is that their core expenses are under control.
Okay.
Now, their R&D expenses, both reported and core, did increase significantly.
Yeah, reported R&D was up 24% to $13.58 billion. That's a big jump.
It is, but it reflects their commitment to innovation. They're investing in new technologies, new platforms.
So it's a good sign for the future, even if it means higher expenses in the short term.
Exactly.
Okay, and they also had some restructuring charges.
Right, about $1.1 billion related to their PAGR program.
Okay, and remind me, what's that all about?
It's a program they've been running for a few years to streamline their operations and reduce costs. And it's actually starting to pay off.
Oh, how so?
They're now realizing annual cost savings of $1.5 billion from the program.
So those restructuring charges are leading to real benefits.
They are.
Okay, and finally, let's talk about their financial position.
Right.
They ended 2024 with over $5 billion in cash and investments.
$5.65 billion to be exact. And they have access to a lot of credit facilities.
So they're in a pretty strong position financially.
They are. They have a lot of flexibility to make acquisitions, invest in R&D, and return value to shareholders.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've looked at AstraZeneca's business, their financials, their plans for the future.
We have. It's been a deep dive.
It has, but I think it's been a pretty informative one.
I hope so.
So for you, our listener, what are the key takeaways here?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that AstraZeneca is in a really strong position. They've got a great portfolio of products, a strong pipeline of new drugs, and a solid financial foundation.
They're also committed to sustainability, which is increasingly important for investors and consumers.
Right, and they're not afraid to take risks and make bold moves, like those acquisitions we talked about.
Yeah.
So they're well positioned for continued growth in the years to come. But of course, there are always challenges in this industry.
Absolutely. The regulatory landscape is always changing, competition is fierce, and there's always the risk that a promising new drug will fail in clinical trials.
But AstraZeneca seems to be aware of these challenges, and they're taking steps to address them.
So what's the final thought you'd like to leave our listener with?
Well, I think it's this. AstraZeneca is a company that's worth watching. They're doing some really innovative things, and they're clearly focused on creating value for their shareholders.
And for patients.
And for patients, yeah.
So if you're interested in the pharmaceutical industry, this is definitely a company to keep an eye on.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into AstraZeneca. And as always, we encourage you to do your own research and stay informed about the companies you're investing in.
Always good advice.
Until next time.